here today with Professor Katharina Pistor, who is a professor of law at the Columbia Law School. And she's also an INET grantee, one of our inaugural grantees, with a really fascinating project called Re-theorizing the Relationship Between Law and Markets. Katharina, I've just reviewed your proposal, and it seems a very ambitious one. This relationship between law and markets is also very timely, it seems. But you're reacting to an existing literature, understanding of law and markets, and trying to do some new economic thinking about this. Could you tell us where you position yourself in that?
Yes, I think economists discovered the law and finance link about 15 years ago in the mid-1990s, actually in response to an ill-understood relationship between law and financial markets during the transition from socialism to capitalism. And
in Eastern Europe, you're speaking of.
In Eastern Europe and Russia, right. And the very same people who were deeply involved in designing mass privatization programs there and in developing markets there, and discovered that without law and legal institutions this probably would not work. So almost as an afterthought, they developed a literature on law and finance in which they suggested that law is important for financial markets. But I think they completely under-conceptualized also in that literature both law and markets. One of the most interesting things about these literatures, in 2008 an anniversary paper came out by the same authors, which basically said at the very end that they expected markets to continue to be calm and successful, and that under these conditions the systems would essentially converge on the system that was propagated in the United States and the United Kingdom. And that was published in July of 2008, and of course we know what happened afterwards. So
the financial crisis.
The financial crisis started really to deepen in September of 2008. Of course it had started a little earlier. And I think that was a wonderful starting point to say, well, how much did these theories and empirical evidence really tell us? And shouldn't we rethink a little bit more deeply what law is, what markets are, and how law and finance relates to one another?
So this interest in the relationship between finance and markets, it sounds like is a long-standing one, but how did you get there in the first place? Was it just a topical thing, or where did you start? Where did this come from in your own intellectual development?
I think the most interesting research project I've ever done was to go out to Russia in the summer of 1993 and travel around the country to interview managers and companies that had just been privatized. So they were given a new corporate charter. They were told now that they were members of a board of directors or the chief executive of a company, and all of a sudden they had shareholders that they had never had.
And they didn't know what any of these things meant?
They didn't really know what any of this meant. They didn't know, what would happen with these shares. They didn't know what a clearinghouse would be. They had some ideas where they thought control should lie. They certainly wanted to maintain control themselves. And in Russia, they had a particular privatization program. They hoped that shares would immediately sort of then start being traded on a secondary market, and that ownership rights would be reallocated on a secondary market. And these things didn't really happen. So my travels through Russia, really talking to people on the ground, thinking about how they think about these issues, what they understand markets to be and institutions to be, how they're perceived of law, and seeing how the markets that were presumed to simply spontaneously arise did not arise, led me to think much more deeply about what actually is the interrelationship between finance and law.
Now, this traveling in Russia in 1993, were you a student then, or a young? What stage were you at in your?
I had completed my education in law in Germany, so I was qualified to practice law in Germany, and I was after my second year of the Kennedy School MPA program that I did at Harvard at the time. Yeah.
So this was a formative experience.
Formative experience pre my real academic life, but formed what I was going to do later on. Yes.
Yeah. First thinking about Russia, and now you're thinking, I guess, about the United States and about the global system, really.
I'm also thinking a lot about emerging markets, but of course also about the United States. In some ways, you could say that the subprime mortgage market was the last emerging market that was discovered by finance with similar institutional problems that many emerging markets face too.
Now, let's talk a little bit about this grant that you're doing. You talk about this autonomous rational actor framework. You set up this dichotomy between autonomous, which seems like the economists, is that right? And the socially embedded actor framework. What's the socially embedded actor framework?
That's basically what sociologists do. At the very least, I think they're saying, well, we have to think about where the actors' preferences come from and what shapes them and how their preferences in turn are shaping other things around them. So they really embed these actors into the particular structures from which they come and how they operate, and don't assume that this is everybody therefore behaves the same. They won't, because everybody comes from different structures and backgrounds, and they factor that into their analysis. I wanted to basically play with both frameworks because I found in my own work that because I was unsatisfied with this rational actor framework, one easily takes flight into a more contextualized analysis. Many people say nowadays we have to contextualize. I think the problem with that too is, yes, contextualization is nice, but then what? Can we predict how to respond to a particular context? Do we know enough about that? And I think that's where many of the more contextualized, socially embedded actor frameworks fall short. And since my project is really about a critique, I wanted to critique both frameworks to make it less easy for us to simply take flight into an alternative framework that might have its own flaws too.
Mm-hmm. And in both of these frameworks, the law is sort of the context?
Well,
is that where the law fits in?
I wished it was. I think
Okay.
what I find remarkable is really that both frameworks under-conceptualize the law. Within the socially embedded actor framework, law is part of power structures and hard to distinguish from also political systems and other structures. It's very hard to pin down what law is. With the rational actor framework, law is perceived only as one means to reduce transaction cost and make sure that investors are sufficiently protected, because otherwise they might not do the kind of investments. But in both frameworks, the normative aspects of law and the complexity of legal systems are very much underestimated. So I think both frameworks have to grapple with what law is. If you want to say something about law and finance or law and markets, clearly we have to get a better understanding of what law might be.
Now, one of the really interesting parts about your project, I mean, it's a fascinating set of intellectual issues, but your strategy for making progress on this is you put together this really big team, and you've had a division of labor. Tell me, what was in your mind? Did you have an example of this before that's in your mind, or did you invent this, or how did you come up with this strategy? Well, first tell us what the strategy is.
Well, the strategy is really to say we want to have people from both camps. We want to have people who are familiar with the literature in economics, and we want to have people who are familiar with the literature in socioeconomics or also law, and bring them together around a table and start pushing them towards critiquing their own literatures. But to make this a little bit more palatable, we asked them to identify certain cases, again, in financial markets of their own expertise. So some people are talking about domestic credit markets, other people are talking about sovereign debt markets, yet others are talking about the derivatives markets. They're using these case studies as an analytical device to think about their theories. And the basic question is essentially, if you take a particular case in the context, let's say, of the global financial crisis, you're looking, let's say, at domestic credit markets, maybe at the subprime mortgage crisis, for example, and you really think this through, where does the theory that you engage with, for example, the autonomous rational actor framework, where does that theory break down? And why does it break down? So we do this with specific cases. But what I find fascinating is actually, as I look at the proposals that the different collaborators have sent in already, and if I look at the discussion we had at our first workshop, there are some common trends that are emerging, and I think we're grappling across different cases and across different literatures with some fundamentally similar issues.
So you're creating a little incubator there. It sounds like maybe you're adapting the interdisciplinary discussions that you had with economists. You're just broadening now by bringing in the sociologists. That's where this comes from in your own experience?
I think that's a fair point, yeah. I've been involved in multi-actor research projects before, and I have to say I enjoyed them a lot. So years ago I did a project with economists and lawyers on the role of law and legal institutions in Asia's economic development in the post-war era. These were people from different cultures too, and different disciplines obviously, and I found this very, very fruitful, much more fruitful than only talking to lawyers or only talking to economists.
Well, I hope you will excuse me if I say that we welcome you to our INET economists. You're an honorary economist for us, okay? Katharina Pistor, INET economist. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.